European fragmentation, African genocide, how South American genes forged the world's strongest peace code. Welcome to Deep Sight. I am your genetic navigator, Lawrence Stardust. Today we are going to a place that rarely makes global headlines. No endless civil wars, no ethnic cleansing, no refugee waves breaking through borders. While Europe tore itself apart in 2 world wars, while Asia was repeatedly ripped apart by colonialism and revolution, while Africa struggled through tribal conflicts, this continent has sat like a silent giant, quietly resting in the Western Hemisphere. That continent is South America. You might object, doesn't South America have favelas, drug wars, and political turmoil? True, but those are social problems, not civilizational fragmentation wars. In the past 2 centuries, South America has never experienced large-scale massacres centered on ethnic boundaries. Nothing like the Balkan Wars, the Rwandan Genocide, or the partition of India. Wars between countries have been few, and most conflicts end within days or weeks. Why? Political scientists point to democratic institutions. Economists point to resource endowments. Historians point to colonial legacies. But today, I will give you a completely new perspective, an answer hidden inside billions of cell nuclei, genes. Look at a map showing the distribution of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome haplogroups among indigenous peoples and colonial descendants across South America. What do you see? From the Andes to the Amazon, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, these genetic markers are highly overlapping, highly shared. A Brazilian, an Argentine, a Peruvian, a Chilean. Their DNA similarity is far greater than that between a Serb and a Croat, and even more so than between a Rwandan Hutu and Tutsi. In other words, South Americans find it biologically difficult to classify each other as us versus them. This may be the continent's strongest anchor of peace. Today we stand at this genetic crossroads and ask a bold question. Does shared ancestry, in biological form, cast a stabilizing wall against fragmentation for South America? Station 1. How is South America's population actually composed? Before we dive into genetics, let's answer a basic question. The population of this continent is the world's unique genetic melting pot. No single majority race, but 3 major streams deeply mixed over 5 centuries. The first stream, Native Americans. They were the earliest inhabitants, arriving across the Bering Land Bridge about 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. Today, indigenous people number about 40 million, roughly 8% of the continent's population, but in Bolivia they reach 54%, in Peru 45%. What do Native Americans look like? They belong to the typical Mongoloid, yellow, race, closely resembling East Asians and North Asians. Their skin is usually tan or reddish-brown, darker and redder than East Asians. Hair is black, coarse, straight, with sparse body hair. Faces are broad and flat, cheekbones extremely prominent, chin receding, jaw strong. Noses are high and often aquiline. This tall, narrow shape efficiently warms cold, dry air, an imprint of Ice Age survival. Eyes are dark brown or black. Some have epicanthic folds, the Mongolian fold. The build is relatively stocky, with long torso and short limbs, small hands and feet, all helping to reduce heat loss in cold regions. But the most astonishing feature is their shovel-shaped incisors. While the inside of ordinary upper incisors is smooth, in Native Americans the edges curl inward, forming a concave, shovel-like shape. This trait appears with high frequency in East Asians and Native Americans, and like the blue Mongolian spot on infants' buttocks, it is a genetic stamp confirming blood kinship. Of course, the Americas are vast, and northern and southern natives differ. North American natives are tall, with eagle-like noses. Amazonians are shorter and stockier, with broader features. Andean descendants of the Incas are sturdy, with exceptionally strong jaws. Regarding the origin of South America's natives, the mainstream scientific consensus is that their ancestors came from northeastern Asia, Siberia, entered the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge about 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, and then moved south, finally reaching Tierra del Fuego at the continent's tip. This migration was a very complex process. If you are interested, I can devote a separate episode to it. The second stream, Europeans, mainly Spanish and Portuguese. When 16th century colonizers landed, the vast majority were single men who brought almost no European women. They had no choice but to pair with native women. This was the starting point of South America's mixing. The third stream, Africans, brought as slaves. The colonizers shipped enormous numbers of black slaves, again, mostly male. Once in South America, They also intermarried with native women and mixed-race women. The bloodlines of the three streams thus converged. Today, mixed-race people are the absolute majority. In Colombia, mestizos, European plus native, account for 60%. In Brazil, mixed-race people make up 45.3%, often carrying European, African, and native ancestry all at once. Argentina, though known as the whitest country, still has an average genetic composition that includes 31% native ancestry. Notably, South America has developed a unique, unidirectional gene flow. Over 90% of mitochondrial DNA, maternal line, comes from natives, while over 80% of Y chromosomes, paternal line, come from Europeans. This means the great majority of South Americans have a native grandmother and a European grandfather. Moreover, Brazil has 96 million people of African descent, the largest black population outside Africa. There are also about 2 million Japanese Brazilians, and Peru has a large Chinese Peruvian community. Thus, when you walk the streets of any South American city, you cannot tell a person's entire ancestry just by skin color. There are no racial borders here, only a gradient genetic spectrum. That is the material basis for what we will next call the genetic buffer layer. Station 2, the biological buffer, from genetic melting pot to peace foundation. Let's compare two worlds. On one side is Eurasia. For a long time, it has been covered with genetic islands. In the Balkans, Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks speak almost the same language, yet they slaughtered each other in the 1990s because of religious divisions and minor genetic differences imposed by the Ottoman Empire centuries ago. In the Caucasus, the genetic distance between Chechens and Russians is only a few thousand years of divergence, yet that has fueled two devastating wars. In Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis were essentially the same people before colonizers arrived, but Belgians artificially divided them by nose width and height, and then one side carried out a genocide of nearly 1 million people. What is the common feature of these tragedies? They were able to draw a clear biological line between us and them. Even when that line was artificially invented, once society accepted it, hatred found fertile soil. Now look at South America. Its genetic makeup is one of the most thorough melting pots in human history. 500 years ago, Spanish and Portuguese conquerors arrived, almost all men. They brought no European women. So what did they do? They mated with local native women. Their mixed descendants, called mestizos, quickly became the continent's majority. That was not all. The colonizers later brought African slaves, again, mostly male. They in turn mated with native women and mestizo women. After centuries, South America's population became a continuous spectrum, from the nearly pure European inhabitants of the Argentine pampas, to the nearly pure native highland farmers of the Andes, to the isolated tribes deep in the Amazon. But between these poles are tens of millions of intermixed people. Let me tell you a little story, 3 faces of a Peruvian family. In 2019, a retired teacher named Ana Maria in Lima took a commercial DNA test. The results astonished her. Her mitochondrial DNA was 100% Quechua native, Inca blood from deep in the Andes. Her Y chromosome was 100% Spanish conqueror haplogroup, and her autosomal analysis showed she also had 12% West African ancestry. She laughed and said, "So my distant grandmother was an Inca princess? My distant grandfather was a Castilian soldier? And I also have an African slave ancestor? Then what race am I?" She ran an experiment. She visited 3 different neighborhoods in Lima, an indigenous market, a colonial center, and an Afro-Peruvian cultural area. In every place, the locals said, "You look so familiar, definitely like one of us." Ana concluded, "In South America, everyone has a face that we all recognize as familiar. That is the real genetic buffer of South America. When you walk the streets of Lima, Sao Paulo, or Buenos Aires, you simply cannot tell a person's entire ancestry by skin color, eye shape, or hair type. If you have watched my previous episodes carefully, you might quickly connect with people in Europe by a few words of conversation. But in South America, whoever you meet, you probably won't have that confidence. Don't underestimate anyone. Your neighbor could be a direct descendant of an Inca princess, or the lost heir of a Spanish conqueror, or perhaps a prince from Africa. In such an environment, racism becomes extremely difficult. Not because it's illegal, but because it is biologically untenable. When you arrive, whom do you intend to discriminate against? Your own cousin? Once you understand this, you might see the shadows of Messi, Pelé, Maradona, Ronaldo. You will understand the power of mixing. The 2026 World Cup is about to begin. Genetic power competes on the green field in a peaceful way. That is the unique charm of sport. Genes are another arena. Station 3, the haplogroup map, an invisible bridge. Let's unpack the specific data of the genetic mystery. Human mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, is inherited only from the mother, making it an excellent tool for tracing maternal ancestry. In South America, over 90% of mtDNA consists of native origin haplogroups, such as A, B, C, D. In other words, no matter how European you may look today in Santiago, Chile, you almost certainly have a native grandmother. Y chromosomes, inherited only from the father, are just the opposite. In South America, over 80% of Y chromosome haplogroups are of European origin, mainly R1b. That means, no matter how dark your skin may be in Cusco, Peru, you almost certainly have a Spanish or Portuguese grandfather. What does this mean? It means that the entire population of South America is the product of one big family. Your maternal line comes from the first inhabitants of this land. Your paternal line comes from conquerors who crossed the ocean 5 centuries ago. So does your neighbor. So does your president. So does the street vendor selling corn. This genetic structure has created a web that transcends national borders. Argentines, Uruguayans, Paraguayans, Chileans, their mtDNA is almost identical. You don't suddenly get a different maternal ancestry just because you were born on the eastern side of the Andes. Genetic overlap blurs national borders. Now compare this with Eastern Europe. In Poland, mtDNA is dominated by haplogroups U, H, V, etc., clearly different from Germans to the west and Belarusians to the east. In Ukraine, the frequency distribution of certain haplogroups differs completely between west and east, directly reflecting linguistic and political leanings. In the Balkans, even populations confined to a single valley have their own unique Y chromosome features, providing pseudoscientific fuel for ethnic purification. South America has no such genetic islands. Its genetic terrain is a smooth slope, not a steep cliff. That means politicians who incite ethnic cleansing find it very difficult to get a biological foothold here. Let me tell you a second story, the genetic border town of Argentina and Chile. At the border crossing in the Andes connecting Mendoza, Argentina, and Santiago, Chile, there is a small town called Los Andes. One high school there has a biology teacher who, in 2010, had students do a simple blood type survey. They found that the blood type distribution among students on both sides was almost identical. Even the rare Bombay blood type appeared in both countries' classes. Chilean and Argentine students joked, "Maybe we share the same great-grandfather." Later, a historian checked local genealogies and discovered that during the independence wars of the 19th century, General San Martin's army crossed the Andes, and many soldiers settled and married on both sides of the mountains. The families on both sides were essentially one family. Today, people from Mendoza and Santiago intermarry and hold wine festivals together. Few even remember that a national border once ran through here. When your genes are so mixed that you can no longer distinguish nationality, war loses its us versus them foundation. Station 4. Ancestral anchors. Historical evidence against fragmentation. Someone might ask, has South America really never experienced large-scale ethnic conflict? We need to distinguish two kinds of conflict. One is political ideological conflict, such as left-wing guerrilla wars, military dictatorships, and resistance during the Cold War. These South America has certainly had. The other is bloodline-based conflict, like the Hutu-Tutsi genocide, the Serb cleansing of Bosniaks, the Myanmar military's expulsion of the Rohingya. This kind South America has almost never seen. Why? Because South America's mixed history has created a shared image of we. Let's look at a crucial moment, the independence wars of the early 19th century. From Venezuela to Argentina, the main forces of the uprisings were mixed mestizos and indigenous people. They fought against Spanish colonizers, but even the colonizers, after independence, mostly stayed, intermarried with locals, and integrated into the new nations. Thus, the independence wars were not racial wars, but political wars. After the wars ended, the victors and the defeated did not carry out ethnic cleansing. They married, had children, and became citizens of the same country. Another example, the Chaco War, 1932-1935, between Paraguay and Bolivia. This was the most ferocious interstate war in modern South America, with nearly 100,000 deaths. But it was a territorial war, not a racial war. The soldiers on both sides were mixed South Americans, speaking the same language, Spanish, professing the same religion, Catholicism, and sharing similar genes. After the war, the two countries quickly restored diplomatic relations, leaving no generational hatred behind. Let me tell you a third story. Chaco War veterans reunite. In 1987, a Paraguayan veteran and a Bolivian veteran met by chance in a nursing home in Brazil. They had once fought bayonet to bayonet in the Chaco jungle. When they recognized each other's military insignia, they froze for a moment, then embraced and wept. The Paraguayan, José Rodriguez, said, "I always wondered who I was killing back then. Now I see him. He looks just like I did when I was young. The same skin color, the same accent, both spoke Guarani and Spanish, even the same love for cassava. The man I killed was my brother." The Bolivian, Carlos Mesa, pulled a yellowed photograph from his pocket, a picture of a woman he had found in a trench, with Asuncion, 1930 written on the back. Jose took the photo and exclaimed, "That's my sister." The two old men fell silent for a long time. Later, their grandchildren married. Today, the descendants of this family hold both Paraguayan and Bolivian nationalities, but their family tree simply says, "We come from the Chaco." In contrast, after the Balkan Wars, Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks in Sarajevo still hardly intermarry, still live in separate districts, and still give their children different names. That is the fundamental difference between genetic islands and a genetic melting pot. Station 5. Testing the homogeneity hypothesis, data, and exceptions. In 2026, a cross-border genetic study updated the admixture map of South America. It showed that in the urban populations of Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, over 70% of people possess all three ancestral components: European, Native, and African, in varying proportions. In rural and remote areas, there may be locally pure ancestries. For example, German-descended communities in southern Brazil, or a Welsh town deep in the Argentine grasslands. But these genetic enclaves are too small in population and too geographically isolated to overturn national identity through social mobilization. More importantly, these enclaves have not generated separatist movements. Why? Because mixing has already permeated the upper levels. Even if a German Brazilian's paternal line comes from Germany, his maternal line is likely already native or Portuguese. His children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law will further pull him back into the ocean of mixing. South America's social structure is not a vertical, pure-blood hierarchy, but a horizontal, continuous spectrum. Let me tell you a fourth story, the third generation of Japanese-Brazilian mixing. Liberdade in São Paulo is the largest Japanese community outside Japan. In the 1990s, the first-generation Japanese immigrants still maintained a cultural identity distinct from Brazilians. By the 2020s, the third generation of Japanese Brazilians, such as the successors of soccer player Santos, Alexander Zando, what are they like? A typical third-generation Japanese Brazilian may have the surname Suzuki, but his face already shows clear highland native features. His skin is wheat-colored. He speaks Portuguese with a São Paulo accent. His favorite food is a mix of black bean stew and sushi. His wife may be of Portuguese, African, or native descent. His children look Latin American, not Tokyoite. When asked, "What are you?" he answers without hesitation, "I am Brazilian." Such an answer is almost impossible to hear in the Balkans or the Caucasus. By contrast, in volatile regions of the world, the genetic landscape is often a mosaic. Different ethnic groups live in their own territories, intermarriage rates are low, and genetic boundaries closely coincide with geographical ones. Political agitators can then exploit the biological narrative of US versus them. South America has no such mosaic. It has only a gradient palette. Station 6. The future of continental identity. How long can the genetic stabilizer last? Some worry. Will 21st century global migration and gene editing break South America's genetic balance? Could they introduce new, unmixed populations and replicate the fragmentation of Eurasia? The answer is possible, but very unlikely. First, South America's immigrants come mainly from other Latin American countries, which share the same mixed culture, as well as Europe, Japan, Lebanon, etc. When they arrive, within 3 generations they typically intermarry with locals and quickly blend into the mixed blood lineage. Even the most recent migrant groups, such as Haitians or Venezuelan refugees, have not formed completely isolated genetic enclaves. South American social culture is itself hybrid, and it continuously absorbs new foreign components in return. Second, South America's political tradition, though occasionally volatile, is maturing, forms a positive feedback loop with its genetic structure. When a society is already accustomed to ethnic mixing, any politician who tries to restore a pure-blood ideology will find it very hard to gain broad support. Voters will say, Who are you talking about? My uncle is exactly that other you describe. Finally, we must admit that South America is not perfect. Racism still exists, especially discrimination against indigenous and African-descendant people still has social roots. But this discrimination is a product of social class. The poor are discriminated against, not a product of biological boundaries. A dark-skinned rich person will not be kept out of an upscale neighborhood. A light-skinned poor person will not automatically become elite. That is fundamentally different from apartheid South Africa or Jim Crow America. Final station: peace wisdom drawn from genes. Now, let's return to the original question. Does shared ancestry stabilize South America? The answer is, it is one of the core components of the stabilizer, but not the only one. Institutions, economics, geography, and history also play roles. But genes provide a base operating system. When your neighbor cannot be biologically defined as the other, extreme nationalism loses its fuel. We can learn 3 things from South America's genetic story. First, mixing is a catalyst for peace. Purity is a trigger for conflict. The bloodiest wars in history have often occurred in regions with clear ethnic boundaries. South America bought itself a long-term peace insurance policy with 5 centuries of mixing. Second, genetic distance can be shortened by social action. Intermarriage, migration, urban integration. These behaviors are not mere cultural appendages. They are direct builders of political stability. Countries that encourage cross-ethnic interaction are less likely to break apart than those that reinforce ethnic boundaries, e.g., allocating quotas by race, setting up ethnic residential districts. Third, do not underestimate the power of biology, but do not fetishize it either. South America's genetic homogeneity provides a foundation for peace, but a foundation is not destiny. If society chooses to regress into hate politics, genes alone cannot stop it. Fortunately, most South American countries have chosen the opposite direction. They have turned their genetic heritage into a shared identity, not a label. When you stroll along Copacabana Beach in Rio and see people with black, white, and brown skin wearing the same swimsuits and playing volleyball together, when you sit in a cafe in Buenos Aires and overhear a neighboring table discussing soccer in Spanish with an Italian accent, when you wander through a market in Lima and see an old woman selling potatoes whose face combines Inca contours with Spanish cheekbones, you will understand that the calm of this continent is not accidental. It is written in everyone's mitochondria, in everyone's Y chromosomes, in the long story told by 2 billion nucleotides. South America is not a paradise without problems, but it is a successful human experiment. When bloodlines from 3 continents were forced or willingly blended together, the result was not destruction, but a new community capable of resisting hatred. Perhaps the rest of the world is restless and fragmented precisely because it lacks such a genetic buffer layer. The lesson of South America is, peace is not a treaty signed on paper, but a memory that flows in the blood. And maybe, in the briefness of human life, that quiet, unhurried serenity is even more precious. Dear friends, thank you for following me through all our stations. If you enjoy this cross-disciplinary perspective that spans genomics and political science, please like, subscribe, and share. Feel free to leave your comments. Let us work together for human civilization and peace, and explore the unknown codes together. By genes we learn fusion. By history we learn the rise and fall of nations. I am your time-space navigator, Lawrence. See you next time.